What's up, Tailgaters? My name is Tailgate Nate. Welcome back to my channel. You guys are getting an extra video this week. I've told you this was coming. We are going to be going through some playoff talk. I know finally on the channel I've done playoff predictions, everything like that, but I haven't really done a whole lot of, okay, if this happens, then this is going to be the field. If this happens, this is going to be the field. Today is finally that day that I get that done. We're going to go through ways that 6 different teams, the top 6 teams in the playoff rankings, can make the college football playoff and not just have a shot at making, like secure a spot in the college football playoff, what they need to do and what has to happen. And then we're going to go through 7 different playoff scenarios, and it's going to be from the easiest scenario for the playoff committee to what the actual heck just happened. And we will get there, I promise. There still could be a lot of chaos this college football season, and with the amount of chaos that there's already been, wouldn't be surprised necessarily if it happens. Before we get into all that, though, I want to thank you guys for clicking on this video. If you like college football content and you want to see more content from me, please, I would suggest you hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out as well. You can also like the videos, comment on them. I love hearing from you guys. Share, ring the bell. Anything you can help support the channel does mean a lot to me. So let's go ahead now, and I'm going to tell you guys how the top 6 teams in the playoff rankings can get into the college football playoff. So there is one team that is already in the playoff no matter what. They can win by 30, lose by 30. They can win a close one, or they can lose on a game-winning field goal. It doesn't matter, but the Georgia Bulldogs are already going to be in the college football playoff. That is set in stone. That is final. I see no way that Georgia falls out of the top 4 with what they have done this season. They've shown clearly up to this point, they are a cut above the rest of college football. They are in the college football playoff. They're going to be competing for a national title. There are 2 teams to where all that they have to do is win their conference championship, and it's that simple. If they win their conference championship, they will get in the college football playoff. Alabama and Michigan. If those 2 teams win in their conference championship game, they will be players in the college football playoff. No questions asked, period, end of story. I hear you guys saying, what about Cincinnati and Oklahoma State? If they win, they're going to be in the playoff too. I'll explain why they are not in the win and in category here in a little bit. But these 3 teams, very, very simple stuff. Georgia, they're already in. And if Bama and Michigan can win in their conference championship games, they will be in if they get the job done. Now, here's Cincinnati and Oklahoma State. They do need a little bit of help. Yes, they have to take care of business in their conference championship games, but they also do need some help. What do they need? Well, here's what Cincinnati needs. They need one of Michigan, Alabama, or Oklahoma State to lose. Yes, Cincinnati is already in Cincinnati's already in a playoff spot. They are already in the top 4. But and we'll go through a scenario later. If they get into a conversation where it's them versus Notre Dame, obviously Cincinnati would win because of the head-to-head. But if they get into a conversation between them and Oklahoma State, then that's going to be a problem, and it's going to be a debate. And the same thing goes with Oklahoma State. In order to guarantee a spot in the college football playoff, they need one of Michigan, Alabama, or the aforementioned Cincinnati to lose a game in order to guarantee a spot. Because again, if none of those teams lose, and if we get Michigan, Alabama, Cincinnati, Oklahoma State that win the conference championships, we'll look at that scenario in a second. There's going to be a debate on who gets that 4 spot. Is it Cincinnati? Is it Oklahoma State? There's going to be a debate. I'll tell you what I think the playoff committee is going to do, whether it be right, wrong. It's just what I think the playoff committee is going to do. And I've gone back and forth on that debate, but we'll get there once that scenario comes. And then I haven't talked about Notre Dame yet. For Notre Dame, they need 2 out of these 4 teams to lose. They need Michigan, Alabama, Cincinnati, and Oklahoma State. 2 of those 4 teams need to lose their games this weekend in order for Notre Dame to get in. Because if 2 teams lose, then Notre Dame will jump up 2 spots, even though they don't have their conference championship game. Likely, though, you would want Cincinnati to win because that makes Notre Dame look better. Cincinnati would then be a playoff team if they win and, say, Alabama loses, something like that. And then Notre Dame, and then if another team on that list loses that's not named Cincinnati, they can get in. If Cincinnati loses and, say, Michigan loses, yes, Notre Dame will still probably get in. It just might be a little bit more of a debate. See where I'm going with this? All right. Let's go ahead now and get into some scenarios. And the first scenario we're going to start out with is just, actually, I forgot about this. I actually forgot I had this on here. Some of you guys might be asking, what about 2-loss teams? We're going to get there. Yes, it's still possible for a 2-loss team to make the college football playoff, and we'll get there. We will talk about how a 2-loss team can get into the college football playoff. 2 of them that you see on screen have a shot if a lot of chaos happens. But let's go ahead now. Now we will get into scenarios. I apologize about that. But 2-loss teams, there's still a shot that a 2-loss team gets into the college football playoff. And even if a team like Alabama this week were to lose and get 2 losses, Oklahoma State gets 2 losses, Michigan gets 2 losses, again, there's still ways that they can get in, but I'll talk about that once it comes. So now 7 scenarios from chalk to chaos. Let's get into it. The first scenario, of course, obviously, is chalk. The favorites win their games. This is the easiest scenario for the playoff committee, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It goes as follows. Georgia beats Alabama. Michigan beats Iowa. Cincinnati beats Houston, and Oklahoma State beats Baylor. This is done. This is simple. This is easy. And the playoff field would look like this. This would be your playoff field. You're going to have Georgia at number 1, facing Oklahoma State, who will end up getting the 4 spot. You're going to have Michigan at number 2, who will play Cincinnati, who will get the 3 spot. Now, I could see a world where maybe Oklahoma State blows out Baylor and Cincinnati wins a close one to Houston. Maybe they have Oklahoma State leapfrogging Cincinnati, and Cincinnati would play Georgia as the 4 seed, and Michigan would play Oklahoma State. But saying that, again, not getting into big details like if this team wins big, if this team wins by if this team wins big, if this team wins by not very much. I'm not going to get into that in this video. It's just a matter of simply win or loss, because then things just get way too complicated. There's all this, yeah, okay. But chalk, easy enough. No matter how these teams win their games, I think this is going to be the field. Cincinnati's already above Oklahoma State, so I think they'd get the nod at 3. And if you're looking at this field right here, you have 4 pretty new teams. Georgia's only been here once, but Oklahoma State, Michigan, Cincinnati, they've never been to the college football playoff. So this would be a pretty exciting field in the college football playoff. But that's the chalk scenario. That's the easiest scenario that's out there. Let's move on now to scenario number 2, which I call roll tide. And basically everything stays the same, except Alabama is going to be beating Georgia in the SEC championship game. And this is probably the scenario that a lot of Cincinnati fans and a lot of Oklahoma State fans are dreading right now. If they can take care of business in their conference championship games, Michigan wins out. Michigan is going to get a spot. Bama and Georgia will get a spot. Because, again, Georgia likely is already in. Bama, in this scenario, beats Georgia, and then Michigan beats Iowa. So there's 3 spots taken. There's only 1 spot left. It's a 4-team playoff. There's no 4-5 play-in, although this likely, not would make a 4-5 playoff, but what would be kind of a debate for one, even last year in early Texas A&M. But this year, it'd be Cincinnati and Oklahoma State trying to, battle it out for that 4th playoff spot. And all season, it's been Cincinnati that's been above Oklahoma State. But Oklahoma State clearly has played the tougher schedule in the Big 12. They've already beaten Baylor. They would have beaten Baylor twice. And now, this week, if they beat Baylor, they would have beaten Baylor when they were a top 10 team, and they get the conference championship. For Cincinnati, they haven't really played anyone super special besides Notre Dame, and they got another Power 5 win at Indiana, even though they're one of the worst teams in Power 5 this year. Still a Power 5 win on the road. And then if they win this game here against Houston, that's going to add another boost to this resume. But Cincinnati's been looking good for most of the year. Yeah, they had a couple shaky games in October and November, when they needed a statement, they couldn't get one. But Cincinnati's been above Oklahoma State this entire time. But Oklahoma State just beat a top 10 team. So you see, this is going to be a very interesting conversation in the committee room if this scenario were to play out. But what I think is going to happen is, because Cincinnati has been above Oklahoma State this entire year, I think Cincinnati gets in. Now, this would be the scenario where you could also say, okay, so how did they win? Did Cincinnati blow out Houston and did Oklahoma State win a close game? In that regard, Cincinnati likely gets the nod. But if Oklahoma State, say, blows out Baylor and Cincinnati wins by 1 point, Oklahoma State might jump Cincinnati and get the nod there. So this scenario is going to be very interesting to see who gets that 4 spot. But I think 1, 2, and 3 are pretty straightforward if the top 2 games are correct. It'd be Alabama at 1, Michigan at 2, and Georgia at 3. So in my predictions for what the committee will do, again, I could see them putting Oklahoma State in here at number 4. I just think with them having Cincinnati above Oklahoma State for the entirety of this season, that Cincinnati stays put at number 4 if this scenario were to play out. But I have Alabama facing Cincinnati in the first semifinal, and then in the second semifinal, I'll have Michigan playing Georgia. And again, this is another interesting playoff field. You have Bama, who's a perennial year. Georgia's only been there once, but Michigan, Cincinnati again. Still 2 new teams to the playoff. Even if Oklahoma State were to be in there, it's still 2 new teams to the playoff. My personal opinion is if the scenario plays out, Cincinnati will get to go in. Would I be surprised if the committee ended up putting Oklahoma State in if this scenario happened? No, absolutely not. But I think with Cincinnati being ahead of Oklahoma State pretty much the entire year, Cincinnati will go ahead and get the nod to move forward into the Group of Five's first ever college football playoff appearance. This is probably the most interesting scenario we're going to see, and it's not that unlikely to happen either. But this is definitely the most interesting scenario I have on here. Now let's get into a little bit more, not necessarily chaotic, but let's go one by one. So we just saw what happens if Georgia loses. Well, now what happens if Michigan loses? We got a B1G big upset here if Iowa is able to pull off Michigan, and then we get chalk the rest of the way. And again, this is what happens to open the door for Notre Dame. So obviously, Georgia would get the 1. I think Cincinnati would jump to number 2. Oklahoma State would get the 3. It necessarily wouldn't matter who gets the 2 or 3 spot there. And then Notre Dame would be in the college football playoff if this scenario were to take place. Because again, what did I say Notre Dame needed? Well, they need 2 of the 4 teams above them to lose. And in this case, it was Bama and Michigan that took the fall for Notre Dame. So in this case, Notre Dame would get in. This is how the playoff field would shake out. If Michigan were to lose, the Big Ten would not have a representative in the college football playoff. And there you go. There are your 4 teams in this scenario. So now what happens if, well, the Group of 5 fever dream ends? If the Bearcats lose to Houston, what happens in this scenario? I think it's pretty straightforward here as well. It's Georgia, Michigan, Oklahoma State, and then Notre Dame. Here you go. You're going to have Georgia playing Notre Dame, Michigan playing Oklahoma State. I think this is also pretty straightforward. These next couple scenarios are just what happens if one of the team loses. I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of scenarios like, okay, what if this combination team, again, I told you I'm not going to do that. We're just going down the line. But if Cincinnati were to end, it's likely no college football playoff for them. Although I will say the debate will be interesting between Cincinnati and Notre Dame at number 4. Because Cincinnati has the head-to-head against Notre Dame, if this scenario were to play out, I could see a world where Cincinnati does end up making the playoff. I just see it as a very unlikely world, and I think that the committee would go ahead and put Notre Dame in. Now, the thing I haven't mentioned with Notre Dame yet is how's the committee going to evaluate Notre Dame without Brian Kelly, with Marcus Freeman being that head coach now? And honestly, I don't think they should evaluate them any different. And if they do, then obviously something in the committee room needs to be cracked down on. But again, if Cincinnati loses, I see this as the playoff field if we get chalk the rest of the way. Scenario number 5 I have is Bear Attack, and that's if the Baylor Bears pull off the upset and beat the Oklahoma State Cowboys. And again, you're going to have Georgia, Michigan, Cincinnati, and Notre Dame in the playoffs. So I basically just went through every scenario that gets Notre Dame into the college football playoff. And here, you're going to have Georgia versus Notre Dame at 1 through 4, and Michigan versus Cincinnati at 2 through 3. So if one of the teams not named Alabama so say like Alabama loses and then one of the other 4 teams loses, it will be Georgia versus Notre Dame in that semifinal. Again, let's say Georgia were to lose and then Michigan were to lose. Again, we already went through. We haven't really gone through that scenario, but we're going to get there, right? So scenario number 5 I have is Bear Attack. Again, this is the playoff field if Oklahoma State were to get upset. In my opinion, again, I think Notre Dame get the nod over Alabama. They'd get the nod over Baylor, Oklahoma State. Just being that team that's there, I see this as likely what the playoff committee ends up doing. Now let's get into some more interesting scenarios. And I got 2 scenarios left here for you. Again, if you guys want me to talk about other scenarios or you want to put your own opinions in the comment section below of scenarios I didn't necessarily cover, go ahead. Feel free to do it. I'm just not going to go through every single combination of team because then this video would take too long. But let's move on to this one now. This is a very interesting scenario. Power 5 chaos. And basically, it's where the underdogs in all of the Power 5 conference championships end up winning. You have Alabama defeating Georgia. You're going to have Iowa defeating Michigan. You're going to have Baylor defeating Oklahoma State. Now, this is where things get kind of interesting. Let me pull up my predicted playoff field and what I think the committee would do in this scenario. I think it's pretty straightforward if you really think about it. It's not that difficult. Bama would get in at 1, Cincinnati would be number 2, Georgia would fall to number 3, or of course, if you want to switch those 2 at the bottom, go for it. It just matters what color jersey they wear. And then Notre Dame would get in at number 4. The problem with this scenario is that you are leaving out 4 Power 5 conferences, and the committee might look at Notre Dame. Again, this is going back to Notre Dame. They might look at Notre Dame and say, okay, but are they really going to be this good under Marcus Freeman? Are they going to be as good as they were under Brian Kelly when Marcus Freeman is the head coach? Again, I don't think that's how the committee should look at it. But again, it's a very plausible way that the committee could look at this Notre Dame team. So the only problem with this scenario is that you're leaving out 4 Power 5 conferences, which is mind-boggling. The Big Ten, the ACC, the Pac-12, and then, of course, the Big 12, no representatives in the playoff at all, which, again, these would be the only teams in the country that are either undefeated or have 1 loss, besides UTSA, but they're nowhere close to making the college football playoff. But these would be the only teams that would be there. Right? This is a very interesting scenario here. I have the feeling, and I'm pretty confident that this will end up being the playoff field with Bama facing Notre Dame and Georgia facing Cincinnati. If all the underdogs in Power 5 were to come out as victorious. But there you go. Okay, well, it's the moment you guys have all been waiting for. It's scenario 7, which I have titled WTF Just Happened. And this is where the playoff committee is going to have a whale of a time deciding who should get into the college football playoff. And the scenario goes as follows. Georgia beats Alabama. Iowa beats Michigan. Houston beats Cincinnati. Baylor beats Oklahoma State. Now, for starters, this scenario, very unlikely to happen. But there is still the possibility. Again, this season has been chaotic already. There's still a possibility that this is what happens, right? And my predicted playoff field is, well, I don't know. I have no idea what the playoff committee is going to do, because you're going to put Georgia in. That is clear and obvious. And then Notre Dame would have to rocket all the way up to number 2 just because of the teams in front of them losing. And Notre Dame would have the best record left besides Cincinnati. So now the interesting thing is, for 3 and 4, I think there are 3, maybe 4 teams that the committee would look at here to put in. And that's why I don't really have in here, because the conversation there is wild. I think the 4 teams that would be considered are Iowa, the winner of the Big Ten in this scenario. Baylor, the winner of the Big 12 in this scenario. Oregon, and it's not on the screen, but we'll just say Oregon wins the Pac-12. And then Cincinnati, because Cincinnati has the head-to-head win over Notre Dame. And even though they don't have the conference championship, head-to-head is also a criteria. What I think that the committee would end up doing is, I think the committee would put in Baylor. And I think Baylor would get the number 3 spot. Who would get the 4th spot, though? Would it be Oregon? Would it be Cincinnati? Would it be Iowa? And I could see a case where any combination of those 4 teams makes it in this scenario. It just depends on what the playoff committee feels is right. But if this scenario happens, I think Sunday is going to be a very, very interesting day to see who makes a New Year's Six bowl spot, to see who makes the playoff. But this scenario, absolute chaos. And honestly, I wouldn't mind if it happened, because then just let teams run free. If this scenario happens, though, I think there should be a lot of push to get to at least an 8, if not 12-team playoff. I know that members aren't going to meet again until January because talks stalled again. And I don't know if this is going to go anywhere until the current contract expires. But a year like this, and if this scenario plays out, just shows how much playoff expansion is needed. But there you go. Those are some scenarios, how different teams can make the playoff, what necessarily can happen. Saturday should be a lot of fun, though, right? All right. Hey, enjoy. So there are a couple championship games on tonight. There are also a lot of championship games on Saturday. So enjoy your college football weekend. Again, thanks for clicking on the video. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, anything you can to help support the channel. It really does mean a lot to me. If you guys want to talk college football playoff, please feel free to do so down in the comment section down below. I'd be happy to even reply, get into some conversations. And remember to play hard, but tailgate harder. I will see all of you guys probably late Saturday night with my college football championship review. See you guys then. Goodbye.